The Raiders of Dixie, a true tale of audacity, sacrifice, and the most dangerous train heist in American history. Part 1. The Unspoken Orders. They say the first casualty of war is innocence. For the 22 men who stole a train deep behind enemy lines, the first casualty was silence, and the price they paid for breaking it was either glory or the gallows. April 1862, northern Georgia. The air was thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and the heavy, humid anxiety that hung over the border states. 2 years into the Civil War, the Confederacy was a tightening fist, but there were still cracks in its grip, cracks the Union was desperate to widen. At the heart of this desperation stood a man of enigma, James J. Andrews. Andrews wasn't a soldier, not officially. He was a spy, a smuggler, and a confidence man with an almost magnetic charm and a face that could belong on a classical Roman coin. He'd made a fortune running quinine and other desperately needed goods across the lines, swearing allegiance to whichever side offered the highest profit. This ambiguous loyalty made him uniquely suited for the most audacious mission of the war, a mission so preposterous that Abraham Lincoln himself likely never heard the full details, lest he be forced to deny it ever happened. Andrews' command came directly from General Don Carlos Buell, the Union commander in Ohio, who desperately needed a breakthrough in the Western theater. The Confederacy's logistical lifeline was the Western and Atlantic Railroad, W&A, a critical 138-mile artery running from Atlanta north to Chattanooga. If that line could be severed, the entire Confederate operation in Tennessee would starve. Buell didn't want the track damaged. He wanted it obliterated. On the night of April 11th, 1862, Andrews gathered his volunteers in a secret meeting house in Shelbyville, Tennessee. They were a motley crew of 22 men, all soldiers from Ohio regiments, hand-picked for their intelligence, courage, and, crucially, their ability to look like harmless Southern laborers. They were all young, some were barely men, still carrying the soft features of their youth beneath layers of trail dust. "Gentlemen," Andrews began, his voice a low, mesmeric baritone that cut through the room's tension. "You are not going as soldiers. You are going as laborers from Kentucky, making your way south to join the Confederate service. Your papers are ready. You will travel in small groups, 2 or 3 men maximum, to Big Shanty, Georgia. You must know no one but your immediate partners." He pointed at a crude map pinned to the wall. "Our objective is here, Big Shanty. It's a staging post, not a town, just a few dozen buildings and a railway depot. We meet there on the morning of Saturday the 12th. A young private named William Pittenger, a slight, studious-looking man who would later write the definitive account of the raid, nervously cleared his throat. "Mr. Andrews, the W&A is heavily guarded. If you are caught, Private, you are merely deserters from the Kentucky service, changing regiments. You know nothing of me. You know nothing of the W&A, except that you wrote it. Your reward, should we succeed, is $100 and a full promotion. Failure." He paused, letting the implication hang in the kerosene-lit air. Failure meant the rope. They were officially behind enemy lines, under uniform, and committing an act of industrial sabotage. Under the Confederate Articles of War, they would be executed as spies. The mission was simple in its execution, but epic in its scope. Steal a locomotive, steam north 100 miles, and burn every bridge they crossed, tearing up the track behind them, thus rendering the Confederates' main supply line useless for months. The target train was the morning passenger express. Its locomotive was one of the finest in the South, a gleaming machine known as the General. For 3 days, the raiders trickled south, melting into the landscape, riding Confederate trains, sleeping rough, and enduring the constant, heart-stropping scrutiny of Confederate patrols and curious citizens. They were 22 actors in the most dangerous play of their lives. Part 2. The morning of the Great Abduction. April 12, 1862. Big Shanty, Georgia, modern Kennesaw. Big Shanty was a hive of activity that morning. A large Confederate military camp, Camp McDonald, was situated right next to the railway line. The noise of drilling, the smell of bacon cooking, and the sight of hundreds of armed Confederate soldiers made the designated meeting point the most dangerous place the raiders could possibly be. Andrew stood near the small station house, his hands tucked casually in his pockets, affecting the air of a gentleman traveler waiting for a connection. He counted his men as they emerged, seemingly from nowhere. From the shade of a water tower, from behind a stack of lumber, or simply walking with deliberate slowness down the muddy road. 21 men reported, all in their rough civilian clothes. At 6 a.m., with a mighty blast of steam and the deafening clank of iron, the W&A southbound passenger train pulled into Big Shanty. The engine itself, the General, was a magnificent sight. A bright red and green 440 American-type locomotive, tended by its dedicated crew. The train consisted of 3 passenger carriages, a luggage van, and several freight cars. The conductor, William A. Fuller, a lean, tireless man who knew every inch of the W&A, announced a 20-minute stop for breakfast. This was the moment. The plan hinged on the universal rule of the Southern Railroad: breakfast is sacrosanct. As soon as the passenger cars emptied and the officers and soldiers aboard lumbered off towards the small hotel dining room, Andrews gave the silent signal. The raiders moved with the practiced efficiency of men who knew the stakes. 3 men, led by Andrews, detached the General from the rest of the train. 2 others, including Private Wilson Brown, a skilled mechanic, climbed into the cab. The rest stood guard near the detachments, trying to look inconspicuous while their hearts hammered against their ribs. Conductor Fuller was halfway through his grits when the sound hit him. The low, urgent hiss of the General being throttled forward. He spun around. The beautiful locomotive with 3 empty boxcars coupled behind it was already starting to move. "Hey!" Fuller yelled, dropping his fork. "Someone's stealing the engine!" The sight of the General pulling away, seemingly without its crew, was so preposterous that the soldiers pouring out of the dining room hesitated, laughing at first, thinking it was a joke or a mistake. Andrews, standing in the cab next to the throttle, looked back at the receding figures. He pulled the whistle cord, a long, triumphant blast that echoed over the Georgia pines. The Great Locomotive Chase had begun. It was 6:15 a.m. Part 3. The 100-mile dash. Andrew's initial plan was sound. Maintain a high speed, stop only to tear up tracks, cut telegraph wires, and most importantly, burn the bridges. The 3 boxcars were essential. They carried the necessary tools: crowbars, axes, ropes, and served as a mobile shield against any pursuing train. They intended to drop one car at each river crossing, set it ablaze on the bridge timbers, and ensure total destruction. They passed through the next station, Ackworth, with a wave, leaving the startled station master in the dust. They were moving at a speed of about 30 miles per hour, fast for the time, fueled by Georgia pine and adrenaline. But their first problem arose immediately. Andrews had meticulously studied the W&A schedule. He knew he had to keep to the schedule to avoid head-on collisions with southbound freight and mail trains on the single-track line. He anticipated passing one major freight train at Kingston, 20 miles north. When they arrived at Kingston, however, chaos reigned. The northbound schedule had been entirely disrupted by the Part 4, the burning bridges and the broken plan. Andrews and the raiders realized that Fuller was gaining ground when they looked back near the Addersville crossing. They could see the column of black smoke from the pursuing locomotive, a terrifying sight. "We must burn the bridges," Andrews yelled over the roar of the engine. Their plan was to burn Calhoun Bridge and the massive Chickamauga Bridge, 2 trestles over deep gorges. At Calhoun, they stopped, detached a boxcar, and tried to set it alight. The wood, however, was still damp from the previous night's rain. The fire sputtered and died before it could catch the bridge timbers. The delay was fatal. Just as the men scrambled back into the General, the Texas appeared around the bend, its smokestack belching black vengeance. Fuller and his crew had been tearing through the countryside, barely slowing for switches or curves. Now it became a running gun battle. The raiders tried to drop railroad ties on the track, hoping to derail the backwards running Texas. Fuller simply pushed through them, the massive pilot of the Texas tossing the ties aside like kindling. Next, the raiders tried their most dangerous tactic, dropping the remaining 2 boxcars, setting one of them alight as they dropped it. The plan was a near-perfect execution of railway warfare, dropping a full-sized boxcar on a tight curve, tearing up the track right behind it. Fuller saw the car coming. He hit the brakes on the Texas hard. The burning car, a massive obstruction, slammed onto the track. Part 5. The Hunter and the Hunted. The capture of the raiders became a monumental manhunt across the South. The Confederacy had been humiliated. Its critical supply line had been compromised by a handful of Union saboteurs. They were determined to make an example of them. The 22 men scattered into the dense, hostile environment of northern Georgia and Tennessee. Their fate became a brutal lesson in the realities of war espionage. Civilian hostility. The locals, fiercely loyal to the Confederacy, were highly suspicious. Any man caught in civilian clothes and unable to convincingly explain his presence was immediately reported. Lack of supplies. The raiders had carried minimal food and no long-term survival gear. They were quickly weakened by hunger and exposure. Bloodhounds and cavalry. The pursuit was immediately escalated to include hundreds of Confederate cavalry and the relentless use of bloodhounds, a terrifying and often inescapable tool of the Southern military. Andrews, the leader, was captured within 2 days. He had sought refuge in a local house, disguising himself as a weary traveler. But his smooth hands and refined accent betrayed the image of a Kentucky laborer. He was recognized and quickly taken. Private Pittenger and a few others were caught trying to cross a river near Chattanooga. Many were captured while attempting to barter for food, their Union-issued coinage immediately giving them away. Within 2 weeks, all 22 raiders were captured. The interrogation and the gallows. The prisoners were taken to Chattanooga and then to Atlanta, where they were held in grim, overcrowded prisons. Andrews, as the ringleader, was subjected to intense interrogation. Confederate officials, hoping to learn about the larger Union strategy, tried every tactic, from physical torture, though the full extent is debated, it was common practice, to psychological terror. Andrews, knowing the danger of revealing Buell's plan, remained stoic. He insisted they were merely unauthorized adventurers, not part of a coordinated invasion. The Confederacy, eager to set an example, decided upon a swift, brutal judgment. A court-martial was convened in Knoxville. Since they were out of uniform and engaged in sabotage, they were tried as spies, a charge that carried an almost certain death sentence. In June 1862, Andrews and 7 of his captured men, including the engineer William Campbell and mechanic Flemings, were sentenced to be hanged. The Long Walk. The escape itself was a study in human endurance and cunning. Pittenger's group, Pittenger and his 3 companions, used the stars to navigate, traveling almost exclusively at night, sleeping in hollow logs or thickets of brush during the day. They survived on raw corn, wild berries, and what little they could scavenge. They avoided all roads and towns, enduring constant encounters with Confederate patrols. Private Shadrach, one of the most physically fit, made a near impossible journey, walking directly through the Appalachian Mountains. His group, suffering from exhaustion and sickness, used a false identity as Confederate engineers to bluff their way past several checkpoints. The Sea Route. 2 raiders, after a week of running, made their way to the coast and managed to get aboard a small fishing vessel bound for the Union blockade fleet, the most dangerous but fastest way out. The Confederacy launched an immediate and massive manhunt. Every single bridge and railroad station was notified. The pressure was intense. One by one, over the next 2 months, the escapees began to appear in Union lines, crossing the Ohio River, staggering out of the swamps, or being rescued by blockade ships. First to return. 2 men made it across the Ohio River on a stolen raft. The last man, Private George Davenport, who had traveled alone for weeks, finally reached Union lines in West Virginia in January 1863, nearly 4 months after the escape. Out of the 22 men who started the mission, 8 had been executed. The remaining 14 had all managed to escape the seemingly inescapable Confederate prison system. Part 7. The Birth of the Medal of Honor. The surviving Raider story did not end with their return. It became a sensation in the North, a desperately needed morale boost for a public weary of war and disheartened by Union defeats. When the 14 escaped Raiders finally made it back to Washington, D.C., they were treated as heroes. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton personally